Today, we're going to talk about how red flags can actually lead to successful relationships and how green flags can actually sabotage successful relationships. So I first noticed this as a psychiatrist when I was working with my patients. And some of them would have really successful marriages, long-term relationships. And as I asked them a little bit about how did you get into this relationship? How did your relationship start? I was stunned by how many red flags were at the beginning of very successful long-term relationships. And even in my own life, I know my wife certainly had a red flag or two. I was basically like a whole parade. I was like addicted to video games, failing out of college, no job after 2 years, being supported by my girlfriend, was going nowhere very rapidly in life. And yet we're still like happily married with 2 kids, and we've been together for like almost 20 years at this point. And so how does that work? Because there's this idea that if there's a red flag in a relationship, you should just dump them and run.
If you're ready to take the next step on your mental health journey, check out Dr. K's Guide. It's an immersive resource that distills over 20 years of my experience laid out in a way that is tailored to your needs. So if you're ready to better understand your mind and take control of it, check out the link in the description below. So it turns out that when there's a red flag early on in a relationship, it leads to problems. And generally speaking, we think problems in relationships are bad, right? But if you look at what leads to successful relationships over time, it is the ability to navigate through problems. And so one really interesting thing happens in red flags in early relationships. If you voice this problem to your partner 1 month in, 2 months in, 3 months in, then you get to know something that's very, very important that will indicate the long-term health or illness of a relationship, which is how do we navigate problems? And what I've seen in just about all of my patients is when there was a problem early on in the relationship, these 2 people either decide then and there, okay, are we like willing to work through this? Do we have the skills to work through it? Do we have the desire to work through it? And then you kind of navigate in that relationship. You're sort of stress testing the relationship with a red flag really early on. And then that leads to actually very good prognostic signs. In my case, I sort of got my life together when my wife, girlfriend was like, hey, like this is not working. This is the way I can support you. This is what I need to do. And could I swallow my pride and actually make an effort to change for the sake of this person? And so the really interesting thing is that red flags basically stress test our problem-solving capability, which is a really, really good prognostic factor for a successful relationship long-term. Because if you've got someone who's got a red flag and they're willing to actually change, that's someone that you may actually want to spend the rest of your life with. Now let's talk a little bit about green flags, because there's also this idea that, like the better this person is, I'm looking for the perfect partner. And the more perfect they are, the more successful the relationship will be. But I want y'all to just like pay attention to this for a second, right? And think about data. Think about the people that you know who are happily married and the people that you know that are unhappily single or whatever, or in unhappy relationships. And think about what their standards are, right? So when someone's looking for the perfect person, they need to do this, they need to do this, they need to do this, they need to do this. What does that actually do to their relationship prospects? It has really interesting sort of implications for what they end up with. The first problem is that sometimes they find what they're looking for. And why is that a problem? Well, so if I'm looking for like these 6 things and these check my criteria, and you lucky person out there, you check my criteria, you are perfect enough for me, right? You're perfect enough. Therefore, I shall bestow upon you the grace of being able to take me out on a date and buy me things. Right? And so this is what happens, and this person is perfect enough. And if that person is perfect enough, sometimes what happens is we are willing to like bypass a lot of these conflicts. If this person does everything that I want them to do, there isn't a whole lot of conflict early on. So we get into the relationship 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months later, a year later, 2 years later, and then the cracks start to show in the relationship. This person is perfect, but they do this stuff. But they do this stuff. And this creates a problem because sometimes what that creates is some kind of conflict, which then either, since you've invested so much time in the relationship, you're willing to like kind of let that slide and let some of that red flag behavior slide because this person is so perfect anyway. Or what happens is y'all end up in conflict, y'all end up breaking up, y'all end up separating in some way because y'all didn't sort of navigate that conflict, because this person is perfect in so many ways. They're a doctor and they're tall and they're rich, or they're beautiful and they've got big tits, whatever, maybe all of the above, right?
And then since they have all of these things, they're not willing to compromise because they are worth so much that, hey, it's take it or leave it. If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. So all these kinds of attitudes start to emerge when people sort of like check a bunch of boxes. And it really delays this idea of conflict to later in the relationship, which then means that people will sink in a lot of time, and then this person ends up being not perfect. And so if you're someone who loves all these green flags and you end up with breaking up with someone after 2 years because they're not perfect in some way, what do you end up doing? You end up adding one more thing to the list, right? The problem wasn't that I can't handle conflict resolution or that we couldn't navigate things or I couldn't compromise and maybe lower my standards. Oh my God, that sounds so bad. The internet is telling me that I never have to compromise or lower my standards in any way. That's not the problem. The problem is that this person was perfect in 6 out of 6, but I missed number 7. And so now what I'm going to do is look for 7 out of 7. And I really want someone who does this. And then the whole cycle repeats. This person is even more perfect. You know, how do you handle conflict? Oh, I handle conflict great. And then you go 3 years in and then everything falls apart. And now you're running out of time because you're getting older. And now you really need to find the perfect person because you don't have time to wait around and screw around. This is a problem. The second big problem with green flags and people who are looking for the perfect person is that we're oftentimes looking for that person to fix something in our lives. We're looking for that person to be the antidote to a problem that we've got. So a simple example of this is like, let's say finances, right? So I'm looking for a partner who can support me, which is totally fine. Like, I think it's totally fine for one partner to financially support another. But one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen in relationships, and if you want to know what leads to toxic relationships, it's when one person is deriving something out of the relationship that is beyond what the relationship should give. So I should get some amount of love and esteem from my relationship. But if I have core self-esteem problems and can't sit by myself or have really crippling loneliness, and I latch on to this person in a relationship to fix all of my loneliness problems, or self-esteem problems, then that relationship is doomed. Doesn't mean that it can't get undoomed, right? Because those problems can be worked on. But this is something, maybe y'all have like worked with someone or dated someone who's very clingy, right? And what's going on with clingy? This is someone who requires you for their own self-esteem. And these people will really drain you and drain you and drain you because you don't have to demonstrate just your love, right? You don't have to demonstrate to them that you love them. You have to make up for the lack of love from every other corner of the world. And that's too much for one person to handle. And so what I've started to see more and more is as people get these really laundry list of requirements, what people are starting to do is almost say like, hey, I'm not going to fix this for myself. I'm just going to find a partner who can fix it for me. And so whether it's financial independence or it's like, I need someone who's going to be available 24/7 and, refuses to go out at night or like is always going to hang out with me first. I need someone who's going to meet all of my emotional needs all the time. These relationships are doomed to fail even if you find what you're looking for. There's one last really interesting thing about emotionally turbulent relationships and why human beings are more attracted to them. This kind of explains why you can't get away from your toxic ex. Right? Your toxic ex is bad for you in a lot of different ways. And so sometimes we're confused, like, why don't I just like stop seeing this person? Why do I respond to their texts? I know it's bad for me, but I can't help myself. So it turns out that there's a lot of really interesting neuroscience and physiology about what attracts us to our toxic exes. So there's a really fascinating study that was done where they had people dating. And the only difference between dates was that one was on a bridge that was made of stone and the other is on a bridge that was like rickety. And what they sort of found is that the emotional fear of the rickety bridge made people fall in love with each other more. That anytime you're in an emotionally unstable environment, it causes people to bond. And so one really interesting thing about red flag relationships, and I know this is true of my relationship, it's true of just about all my patients, is that early like turbulence in the relationship creates actually a lot of negative emotion, and then you'll kind of bind together and work through it. And then you've learned something really, really interesting, which is like, okay, when I'm feeling bad and when they're feeling bad, we're actually a team and we can work through this problem together. And it's also really fascinating because the same principle is why, like, in that emotionally turbulent relationship, it actually provokes attraction, which is sort of why, like, there's this idea that, oh, like sometimes like you're attracted to dangerous people and like, oh, like that person's like a bad boy or bad girl, or like, like avoid crazy ladies, right? So like, bros will say this kind of stuff in like locker rooms and things like that. They'll use other words, which I'm not going to use here today. And there's some truth to that, because there's actually really cool studies that show that emotional turbulence leads to bonding between people. This is also why we see things like trauma bonding. This is also why people fall in love so easily at rehab. I've seen this time and time and time again. And the one rule that I encourage all of my patients to do in rehab is don't fall in love. And at the same time, the number of patients that I've seen, oh yeah, what was the beginning of your relationship like? Well, my partner was addicted to IV heroin, was shooting up every week, and was stealing money from me. And I was like, why didn't you leave them? Well, now they're sober. Y'all have been married for 20 years, 25 years. You've got a 20-year-old kid, an 18-year-old kid, and a 14-year-old kid. Oldest is off in college. Second one's applying. They have like this awesome marriage, right? So at the end of the day, I know it's kind of weird, but I encourage you to really think about the impact of red flags on your relationship. I want you to think about the impact of green flags on your relationship. Is this the kind of situation where I'm looking for perfect, I'm looking for perfect, I'm looking for perfect, and something always falls apart? Are you discounting a large part of the population because they meet some criteria? And if you really think about it, you're losing out on something that's really important, which is finding a partner who's willing to change, who's willing to compromise, who cares about you enough to change a fundamental aspect of their life. And that's probably the kind of person you want to end up with. As a disclaimer, I'm not saying that y'all should chase red flags. I'm not saying that y'all should if there's someone who's like physically abusive or emotionally abusive, that you should continue to date them. I'm not saying that red flags are good, and the more that you have, the better off your relationship is going to be. What I'm saying is that I'm noticing an increasing trend of people looking for perfect. And the more that they look for perfect, the more that they delay conflict resolution. And if you really look at what leads to prognostically very successful relationships, it's the ability to navigate conflict and compromise. And oftentimes, as we discount people with red flags, we don't give people a chance to change and to grow and to whatever. That's actually shooting us in the foot. So it's just something for y'all to think about and hopefully balance a little bit. If y'all are interested in more, we actually have a whole resource pack on communication in relationships. And we also have a couple of really solid YouTube videos that sort of dive into a couple of these things a little bit more. So check them out.